All right, so this next talk is kind of probably the talk with the most number of authors on it at this NANOG, and it's because not any one single of us wanted to really take responsibility for what we did here. So we have a bunch of people up here to talk about prefix hijacking mitigation, and that something may be better than nothing, but really it's quite a paralyzing event on most networks. So here's our outline. We're going to talk about how prefix hijacking, what it is and how it occurs, and how you get it done. Not that any of you should be doing it. But then how do you mitigate against it? What can you do about it? And we'll find out that what can be done is pretty limiting. And then the group of panelists work on an experiment to see if there was something we could do to defend against a prefix hijack. And more on that later, and then we'll get into some Q&A at the end. So prefix hijacking 101. Go into your router, set up a prefix that belongs to somebody else and start announcing it into global BGP and hope you get some traffic. In my particular case, I'm a DNS operator, so that's particularly damaging to me because I don't know who's in the path and who's not in the path necessarily without some really good monitoring. You could always announce a more specific of somebody else's prefix and guarantee that you're going to get that traffic. But essentially the synopsis is that you're trying to steal someone else's traffic off the net. And once you start receiving that traffic, you can now, sniff, capture it, redirect it, manipulate it, send it back out, do whatever you want with it. So, here's the quick example on the same prefix, right? The shorter AS path to the same prefix wins, and our red attacker in the lower right gets some traffic, and he can start doing some things with it. In the case of the more specific prefix, you have the same AS path. More specific prefix wins. We all know this. We've been doing routing for years, and that's how it works. And the attacker gets the traffic. And then you have a talk from a couple nanogs ago, an advanced man-in-the-middle attack where you can actually sit in between two ASNs, hijack traffic, going to your victim, and they never even know that it's occurring. And you can possibly manipulate traffic on the wire as it's going through the network. And that's everything from, copying, observing, and recording the traffic, handing it back to the originator, sitting there and making sure you're manipulating TTLs in ways that hide you, and you're essentially masked to the world. So what's the impact of prefix hijacking? I mean, we were all around the day that YouTube, the day that YouTube died. That was a pretty boring day. But, for space that's in use, it creates problems with existing services. For space that's not in use, suddenly, you don't know your space is hijacked, and you try and bring it online, and things don't work the way you expect. So also bad. And as I said, does this happen, right? We knew about YouTube. Doesn't happen as often as people think. Certainly not, on the basis of days or weeks, but it does happen. And it's a really big threat to your network. Men in the middle, other than experiments, no known cases yet.
There's a semi-exhaustive examination that Renus has performed against at least 1 month worth of data. And as it happens, looking for what looks like a violation of the value-free property that has been proposed across most AS paths is, I guess, a non-trivial amount of computation. So the initial search that was ran, I believe, was just for maybe a month or two. And this presentation was what Renesis gave at Black Hat earlier this year, I believe, March, April timeframe. And it was a small amount of information that trickled out of the filters, if you will, or the method that was employed, including the attack or the hijack at DEF CON in last August, and then a couple other events that were almost like freeze frames of bizarre converged states that persisted. And it turned out to be a few endpoints that were, oh, we forgot we were TEing something, we didn't intend that, oops, kind of stuff. But it was, those needles that were nonetheless still significantly weird origin AS paths or whatever fit the criteria.
So why don't we fix this, right? We've been trying. Peers don't route filter each other. There's no trust anchor system in BGP routing at all yet. There's no way to validate routes in flight. These are all things we're working on. So in the absence of a hijack and the case that it can exist, what do you do? So here's some best practices that we kind of put together about defending against a hijack. So, of course, you need to detect that it's occurring. There's multiple ways to do that. You need to investigate what's occurring. You got to mitigate that somehow, and then you got to clean it up, right? So, step number 0, some preparation. Make sure your prefixes are yours. Make sure they are actually allocated to you. Make sure you have documentation of that, and make sure that if you're routing customer prefixes, that you have LOAs for those. That way, you know that you're supposed to be routing them, and nobody else should be. Make sure you get your prefixes registered in some sort of internet routing database. As a precaution, ask your providers if they will accept and carry a 25 through their backbone for you for your prefixes. This can really save you. We've seen from past discussions that everybody thinks the mythical boundary of the 24 of propagation isn't really real, and that you can get things that are more specific than a 24 to be carried. And also ask your upstreams and your peers about the ways that they deal with mitigation. A couple other things. Don't put your key critical resources in the same net blocks. Don't put your DNS and your web server in the same announcements, because if that announcement gets hijacked, you lose everything. You're much better off to have some services running, and not all, but at least you have something. This was one of the problems with YouTube. Talk to your provider. How much clue do they have about dealing with this? The more clue they have, the better your chances. Join some security groups. There's plenty of them out there. Join them. More importantly, network, form relationships, come to meetings like NANOG, get to know the people that are going to be able to save your butt when this happens, because you're not going to be able to take care of this yourself. You might even want to buy them drinks ahead of time to help save your butt on this. All right, so detection, right? There's lots of tools. You might have something of your own. You might use WriteBriz. You might use FAS. You might use Cyclops. You might use BGPmon. You might use RenAssist. There's plenty of tools out there that can do this for you. Use them. Some of them are free. Some of them are not. So how do these tools work? You know, they'll detect change in ASN. They'll look at route propagation through an unknown path or unauthorized peers. They'll look for origination of a more specific prefix, a different prefix. You have your own traffic monitoring. You know, you expect to get 30,000 packets per second of something. That drops. Well, something's gone wrong. So you start, looking into this. Number 2, start investigating. Make sure it's actually a hijacking, and that, some admin on your network hasn't started announcing more specifics in a place that they shouldn't. Find out who's actually responsible for the hijacking. This is important, and these tool sets can really help you with this. Make sure you gather your evidence very carefully, log things down, because you're going to need this information to get your routes back. So mitigate. So now you start, let's say that your hijack block is a 24, or any block. Find what your most critical elements of that block are, and start announcing them as 25. So deaggregate your block. You're going to rely on the most specific rule winning. This isn't going to necessarily get all of your traffic back, but it will get a lot of it. Then contact the nearest responsible party to the origin of the hijack. They're the people that are most likely going to be able to suppress these prefixes from leaving the attacker and taking your traffic away. Ask them to route filter. Your upstream can also help you with this as well. So contact them. Have them start reaching out into their networks. And again, the RIR, IRR, LOA data that you have may come into play here, because people might want you to actually authenticate that these prefixes are yours. And then finally, when the hijack attempt is over, you're going to have this mess of DAGs that you've started announcing into global BGP. Obviously, get rid of those, because we don't need them floating around in our routing tables. And thank everybody that helped you out. And so this is kind of like what your options are today. As far as, from talking within this group, this is what we thought our options were today. This is your best practice. Get on the phone, make some phone calls, and hope and pray. And then you have the DAG method. That's about it. So we said, let's try something. Let's rely on the fact that route flap dampening causes prefixes to be removed from routing tables and see if that can help you in the case of a prefix hijacking. So what we said is that figure out whatever.
It's not my fault.
That's why there's so many names on the list.
Don't listen to the bald man. Listen to this bald man.
So the concept here is find the route that's being hijacked and flap it more and try and get it out of people's tables by the use of route flap.
It sure sounds funny, doesn't it?
It sounds like it should work, right? You know?
Who thinks it would work? Who thinks it would work? Patrick? Todd? Got a couple in the front row. Who thinks it wouldn't work? Okay, later on, come and ask and say why you think that would be.
All right. So this was our experiment. We took a 23 that was stably announced to the world. We took a 24 component of that 23 and announced that as well. That was our hijacked path. And then we started flapping it with the theory that that 24 would flap enough, eventually route flap dampening would kick in, it would be removed from routing tables, and the original 23 would get the traffic back. So here's what our blocks look like. 24 being announced by the original, the true origin, ASN-A. The hijack state is that the lower 24 was now being announced by the attacker, ASN-B. And then ASN-A comes along and starts announcing the 24 and flapping it, eventually getting it out of people's tables, and boom, the 23 takes the traffic again. So we did this. Sorry about your routing tables, but it was in the name of research. So AS33517 Dynamic Network Services announces 216.146.34/23, and we also announced the lower 24 of that. And our hijacking friend, Mr. Capella, of 5.9's data, AS16842, hijacked the lower 24 of that. So they basically get half of that /23 prefix. So let's take a look at the steady state. We get to a steady state where traffic is being stolen. So we then come back, AS33517, ASN-A, the victim ASN, we start announcing this route to BGP, and we start flapping it. And we did this in two different locations. We started flapping it in New York on a Quagga-based box, and we started flapping it in Chicago on a Juniper-based box. And just because of the way their routing tables are managed, it was much easier to get much more rapid flapping to occur from the Juniper box by shutting and no-shutting a loopback interface that was announcing its directly connected prefix into BGP than Quagga was able to. So that gave us some different results. Then what we did is we had our friends over at Renesys take a look at their global peer set and take a look at which peers were selecting what paths. And in summary, it just flat out didn't work. And we're all kind of flabbergasted as to why it doesn't. And it seems like there's just not enough route flap dampening going on the internet anymore for it to work.
So who really won there? Who really won? That would have been a great method for us guys.
Yeah.
Darn it.
And really what it boils down to is my company became a big prefix flapping jerk in the case. So sorry again. All right, so here's the data. You can see the steady state in blue, the hijack prefix, all the traffic is going over to 5.9's data. We start the New York defense by announcing the prefix into the same 24, and you can see that we get about 15% of our traffic back, not good enough. And the next peak in the graph is when we start flapping it. Didn't work very well. We said, okay, we're going to withdraw that route and we're going to try it from Chicago. So we start injecting the same 24 into BGP in Chicago, and you can see we get about 43% of our traffic back. Still not that great, but that's the steady state. So now we start flapping it, and you can see that we basically only lose over time by flapping the prefix. It stays more stably originated to 5.9's data than it does to dynamic network services. So we have some deeper analysis here. Horizontal lines are individual peers from the Renesys routing set. Each circle is a BGP update. The first slide kind of shows the whole state of the situation, and then the further slides are going to go more in depth. So here's what this looks like for the first and second trial. So red is the attacker's path. Blue is the rightful owner's path. Doesn't look too good. You can see we reach a steady state where we're getting some of our traffic back, but when the flapping actually starts, we lose ground. And that's even more so apparent in our Chicago defense than in our New York defense.
And interestingly, the New York defense, even though it was flapping pretty frequently, say every 15 to 20 seconds, it just did not propagate. There were so many other BGP paths to explore so much nearer to the remainder of your origins that this just didn't really get anywhere. And only a handful of the peers reported it at all.
So now we can get a little bit more specific with this. You can see where we respond by injecting our 24 to get the traffic back. And then you can see on the right when we start flapping, and we just lose ground. Sure.
Go back.
So
what each line represents is the adjacency to the Renesas collection facility and infrastructure. And so the blue circles indicate a transition by which an update or withdrawal would be sent. In the case of the red line going to blue, means in this case, Dynamic Network Services re-originates the exact same prefix length, in this case a 24. And so some of the internet turns back towards the correct origin, away from the attacker's origin. And so each further transition, as we withdraw and announce, if you can go back one more slide, Todd, there we go. The full collection really shows clearly in very small time scale, about 15 minutes, 20 minutes represented in the noisiest section, that the choice that each AS reporting makes can change quite rapidly. This is just pointing out that BGP is converging fast, really, but interestingly, it didn't get the result that we had hoped for, which is a removal of that 24 prefix from the forwarding tables, from the routing information base as well. This one is interesting, though.
yeah, so this is our defense from Chicago. You can see the number of times where there's a couple green circles in here where we actually got a full withdrawal from a peer, but it doesn't occur all that often.
This seems to be fitting with the intuition, though, that we got after asking a few operators and try to take a quick poll. Who does implement any kind of flap dampening? What's the threshold, perhaps, that was set? What are the defaults these days? And interestingly, we discovered that a lot of the folks who have flap dampening available, perhaps in iOS and Junos, do not do it on a combination, anything more specific than a prefix. We had thought it was a path plus the prefix, and that was the recommendation, in fact, in one of the RFCs years and years ago. But it appears as though anyone with flap dampening on was prefix only. So interestingly, unintentionally almost, we shouldn't have been able to cause this behavior at all if that was implemented to spec by what we had read. However, the 4 or 5 that did actually give us a withdrawal and nothing else, that meant that the 24 was really out of the table completely, are a distinct minority, yet they shouldn't have done that to begin with. I find that very, very interesting. Academically, how so?
So our conclusion on this is that, the steady state originator has the advantage here. The attacker had the advantage. The older route in the table was taking the traffic. Me as the defender, it was all my ground to lose in this case. Duplicating the originations got some traffic back, but not anything really usable, and the flapping only made it worse. So it kind of gets us back to, with prefix hijack mitigation, what do you do other than pick up the phone or deag and announce some more specifics? So that was our research. We have some questions that are open. Does anyone flap dampen, and why do people, do you do it? And should this have worked? How much would we have had to flap the route to actually make it work? Is this strategy even possibly effective on the internet today as it's configured? Are the 4 of us that worked on this insane for thinking it even would work? So we'll take those questions now.
Hi, I'm wondering if you can tell us a bit more about the geography of your experiment. You mentioned you were essentially advertising.
Name and organization, please.
I'm sorry?
Name and organization, please.
I'm sorry. I'm a graduate student at Princeton, and I'm looking into this, so I'm acutely interested. Can you give us some because I said some information about just the geography. You mentioned that you're advertising your own /23 out of New York and Chicago. Where was the attacker?
So the attacking, or the in this case the faux attacking ASN was located geographically in Madison, Wisconsin, but from a network diameter or network layout, if you will, was essentially like 2 hops off of the real, if you will, transit-free areas of the DFC. 16842 sits behind today WV Fiber and another intermediary who resells above net cogent and level 3. So it's pretty far off, if you will, in terms of whose edges are directly adjacent and how many people are downstream from those and so forth. So, you know, the only reason the traffic initially came over was just the prefix length winning, but the later attempt to regain the ground actually were still successful at pulling it away. I would posit primarily because it was so far off from quote unquote the core, if you will. I hate using that word, but I don't have a better one for it.
And even in our case, in defending, you know, our network was connected at the time. We were making these originations through Tata, NTT, Level 3, and Telia, who are, you know, if not the default free zone, very close to it, and that was not helping.
Okay, sorry. So both of the New York and Chicago sites were stub sites, but the attacking AS may have had customers of its own, or were all 3 stub sites?
Oh, I would say these are all stubs. Absolutely.
Yeah.
These are ASs which have a transit cone of like 1 or 2 behind them, and almost nothing downstream. These are just hanging off the internet at large.
Sure. Thank you.
Steve Gibbard from GoGrid. I think I can answer your why the flapping didn't work question, which was presumably the only people who saw the flapping were the people who already saw you as the best path.
Good point.
Okay. Yep.
So actually I had a question.
So just name and affiliation?
Mohit Lag Nokia.
Okay.
I had a clarification question which would relate to some of the things I thought about is when you deploy damping, is it per neighbor per prefix or is it just a prefix? So let's say I have 2 neighbors and one of them is flapping the route. Do I take the prefix off my table or do I take it just for that neighbor?
Well, so there's a definite disagreement between the RFC that I was referencing that defined the recommendations for flap damping and what really got implemented in routers. And the research I spent on that weekend basically told me that iOS's implementation was not keying things by default anyway, or not indexing flap damping against AS path and prefix. It was just by prefix. So any origin AS path pattern could cause a prefix to be held from utilization in the fib and also suppressed from announcement in the rib, to my knowledge.
So this is a simple example. Let's say I have 2 neighbors. Okay, I'm getting a /23 from both the neighbors. Now, as it happens, somebody attacks using a /24. Both of them are sending me /24s. The defender now launches a /24 as well. Assume I'm getting that /24 from one of the neighbors, right? There's a good chance that traffic is going to be split. You're going to get half of it. But now you start damping that /24. Which means that that path is going to damp, flap, stop, exactly. And then traffic shifts back to the attacker. So you're probably better off just announcing a /24 and not damping it.
Absolutely. Right. I mean, the data shows us that the steady state condition is much better than the flap condition.
Yeah, we were hoping for the latter.
Hello, Louis Ribari, Comcast. I just wanted to kind of elaborate more on these defense mechanisms and how could they be applied for anycast systems if you were running anycast?
Well, interestingly, the origin in this case, the victim's origin was anycasted, right?
Yep.
This is from Dynamics anycasted space, right?
Right. Yeah.
So in other words, both the Chicago and the New York locations were running the same actual prefix.
Not at the time of the experiment. So the lower, let's go to the chart here. The 23, okay, was unicast announced from New York. Okay. The lower 24 was any cast announced from New York and Chicago.
Okay.
So even though it's Anycast, we didn't flap both sites at the same time, and we didn't announce both 24s at the same exact moment. So their steady state is Anycast, but not for this experiment.
Okay, and I guess the second part of the question is, did you notice any discrepancies or any issues with the amount of peers that do BGP dampening, or not BGP dampening, I mean BGP summarization? In other words, did you see your 24 when it was being routed like suddenly become a 22 or anything like that?
I missed that last part. Did I notice the 24 what?
BGP summarization. There are a lot of ISPs, they summarize. So if you're propagating out /24, you see it as like a /22. Did you see any of your peers, change from /24 to /22 or anything
No,
like that?
they were carrying it.
Richard Steenberg and NLayer. Tom, who are the transit providers of the real network that you were defending?
The real network
Yeah.
in New York, that was through Telian Level 3,
Okay.
and in Chicago, Tata and NTT.
Okay. Well, I was going to say that when Tony mentioned earlier that even though these stub ASs were, had a very long AS path, he mentioned that they were also customers or customers of customers of a large number of networks. So in the end, it may not be a question of AS path. It may be a question of local pref.
Sure.
Local pref their customers.
Sure.
Good point.
So I was wondering if maybe one of the hijacking networks was also a customer of one of the transit networks, and so that's how they had such a good way to override you. But it doesn't seem like it.
I think the only crossover could have been level 3.
Yeah, I think that's the only one.
But that was the only one out of 5 here, interestingly. Good point. Thank you.
Hey, Todd Underwood. So just to summarize and make sure if I've got this. So we were kind of bummed out because there was actually very little you could do other than, to respond to a prefix hijacking other than do your homework ahead of time and make some phone calls and get on IRC, right? That was sort of, and we thought, well, that's disturbingly primitive and silly. There's got to be something better. So Tony comes up with this wild idea, and the whole thing is his fault, by the way. It was entirely Tony's fault. He came up with it. Nobody else wanted anything to do with it. He wrangled us into doing this.
And 5 networks said, you're not going to take it anymore.
That's right.
And his team of thugs came to dine and, put a gun to my back and said, flap that prefix.
So we're back, right? And so I guess part of this is not just a question of you guys, because I think this was one good attempt, and it turns out to have failed miserably in a perhaps interesting way, right? Failed miserably. Interesting that it failed and how it failed. Sometimes reporting failure is interesting. Anybody else got anything else? Because this still seems disturbingly primitive and silly to me. That in terms of all we can do to respond to hijackings is have done our prep work and homework ahead of time, bought beers for the right people here, and hope you have a Rolodex and an IRC and an IM session filled with the right contacts of people who can get stuff done. What's that? Oh, Patrick wants to sell CDN services. I think Limelight helps with this stuff, and maybe BitGravity. There's probably some other CDNs. I can't think of any right now. So that's my question. Anything else? Anybody else got anything else? Because I think that's disturbing.
Okay, it looks like we're in trouble. So
We'll work
thanks,
on
everyone.
it.
Tony's going to work on it and do more testing.
We'll have a better idea.
All right, so